Thank you all for joining us for the Florida Public Service Commission and Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act training seminar. I appreciate all of you making time to attend, and Laura, you can advance to the next slide and I'll explain who I am and what we're going to do here. So my name is David Glassner. I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Associate for Audubon, Florida. I'm based here in Tallahassee at our headquarter office in the Northwest. Go ahead. We are gonna go over basically what the Public Service Commission is and does, as well as the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, which is directed through the Public Service Commission. There are some opportunities for Audubon, Florida to engage to improve some things related to our climate campaigns. And so we wanted to make sure that we took an opportunity to explain exactly what they are so that chapter presidents and staff have a better understanding and everyone can advocate more effectively on them. We will also be providing quote unquote one-pagers on both PSC and what we call FEECA that will provide a bit more digestible information regarding their overview and impacts. And then we'll go over what our next steps are. Audubon, Florida and the chapters have an opportunity to engage the Public Service Commission, which is not something Audubon, Florida has actively engaged on a whole lot before. So we want to make sure that everyone that does engage is adequately informed and has a good understanding of what the issues at hand are. Or we can advance.
Maybe. Not very good at that.
So we are going to talk about energy efficiency and energy conservation. So why this topic is important to Audubon, Florida specifically is the notion of energy efficiency and conservation helps to reduce emissions, reduces our need for generation, and all of these things are aspects that drive climate change and our climate impacts. So energy efficiency and conservation are often considered critical tools in addressing those. You'll hear it often said that the greenest bit of energy is the energy that you don't need to create, because even solar panels and renewable energy sources still have some environmental impact, either through siting or through their production. So reducing our pure consumption number is critical in reducing our emission footprint. Next slide. So climate is one of our strategic priorities for Audubon, Florida, and climate has knock-on impacts for every other aspect of our strategic priorities. Sea level rise affecting coasts, our flooding and inundation on working lands, and other aspects from emissions. Obviously, water is a precious resource, and climate can impact that through saltwater intrusion, through drought, climate changes, and then also affecting bird-friendly communities. The siting of specific plants or generation facilities can obviously have impacts on habitat. So that is why this is a pertinent discussion. So the PSC and the FEECA rule are going to be integral parts for Audubon, Florida to advocate effectively on all of these priorities, not just climate. So before I move on to the next slide, I want to provide some context so that everyone has an understanding of what our endpoint is here. So as I explain some of this, it will be a little, not convoluted, but a little more detailed than you may be prepared for, but I want to give everyone kind of the end goal so that you know where we're headed to. So Florida currently ranks near the bottom of the nation in energy efficiency efforts in the utilities as a measure of how much energy efficiency or how much energy they are reducing within their system year over year. The current national average is about 0.6% year over year. So that means utility companies, by and large, are reducing their energy demand by 0.6%. Florida, our average energy efficiency is 0.12%. There are only 2 states with less energy efficiency standards than we have. So the PSC must evaluate these efficiency goals, which are set or proposed by the utilities and set by the Public Service Commission, to be evaluated every 5 years. So in 2019, they were up for review, and 2 of our utilities in Florida had failed to meet their proposed goals. So the PSC commissioners directed staff to work on addressing what those concerns were, so that they could continue to meet their goals. So the Public Service Commission, otherwise known as the PSC, is a quasi-judicial agency. So they can interpret the law, but they're not an official judicial body. They have staff related to general counsel, they have regulatory attorneys, they have utility experts, and they have engineers on staff as well. In general, they have a broad regulatory oversight over most of the investor-owned utilities regarding electric generation, natural gas, both generation and transmission through pipelines, water and wastewater, and telecommunications. So the PSC regulates over 300 utilities across those industries, and they provide oversight on utility rates, service provisions, the public and utility safety aspects, as well as ensuring competitive markets, and then providing programmatic oversight on things like new generation facility siting. Next slide. So the Public Service Commission consists of a 5-member board who are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate for 4-year terms with no term limits. They are subject to the Government in the Sunshine Law that some of you may be familiar with, which means that any meeting between 2 or more commissioners must be properly noticed in advance and be open to the public. There is a chairmanship who is the acting executor of the commission and who prescribes all of the rules and regulations that the commission must follow. Their offices are located in Tallahassee, but the commissioners are from across the state. The Public Service Commission employs over 200 staff, as I said, including engineers, economists, legal counsel, and regulatory experts. The main goal and mission of the commission is to balance the needs of a utility and its shareholders with the needs of the consumers, and that applies across all of the industries. Next slide. So for this specific discussion, we're going to be focusing specifically on the electric utilities. And in reference to FEECA, the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, it only applies to specific large-scale utilities, this being Florida Power and Light, Duke, Tampa Electric Company, Gulf Power, which is now part of FP&L, Florida Public Utilities Company, the Orlando Utilities Company, and JEA in Jacksonville. So those are the only utilities that are subject to the Florida Energy and Efficiency Conservation Act. Other utilities, such as regional cooperatives, can have their own efficiency standards, but they are not under the same rule requirements and regulatory authority of the Public Service Commission. As part of their responsibilities, the commission holds hearings, which are one of their aspects of public meetings, to examine evidence that's provided by the utilities and interested parties on issues ranging from rate case increases, which are the utilities petitioning for increasing your energy bill, to recoup costs for either new energy generation facilities, new power plants, or transmission lines, and other fixed costs associated with them providing energy to their customers. These are a semi-judicial meeting where utilities must present their expenses through the advice of legal counsel, and legal counsel for the Public Service Commission has a right for examination and discovery. They include in these presentations their costs related to building of generating facilities, expanding or improving service, the fuel costs associated specifically for the facilities that use non-renewable energies. So the natural gas cost, price of coal, what they've expended on that. And it also includes any recovery costs associated with storm damage. Currently, they're still processing through damage incurred to the utilities from Hurricane Dorian. So that kind of gives you a sense of the time frame on where they see their recoveries from. The commission then examines these costs against the revenue of the utility, so the money they receive from customers paying their bills for their electricity. And then it is then the commission's interpretation of that cost and revenue to determine whether the new proposed rates are acceptable to ensure a balance between utilities and their need to provide for stakeholders, as they are a publicly traded company, and the need to continue providing service to its customers. So they have to balance what is required for the utilities to continue to provide service, and if the utility proposes improving or expanding service, they have an opportunity to petition for increased rates in that measure. The commission accepts evidence from both the utility and any interested parties and affirms witnesses. The utility typically has people present on their behalf, petitioning as to why they need rate increases to recoup fixed costs. And the commission structures the proceedings such that they can then hold a formal hearing to make a decision, and assuming there is a quorum present of the commissioners. So with 5, they need at least 3 for a decision to be made on any rate cases or any cases in general. So that's the PSC. So now we'll move on to FEECA, the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act. So FEECA is now 41 years old. It was developed in the 1980s as an attempt to address the growing electricity consumption along with addressing what is called peak demand. You'll hear peak demand a lot in reference to utilities, and that refers to the time in the day in which there is the greatest load on the grid. For utilities, this comes down to one 15-minute period in a year. The utilities are required to be able to provide as much energy as is needed in that peak period. So if everyone turns on their lights at 12:15 in the afternoon, they need to be able to provide enough energy to support that, so everyone's lights turn on. The goals related to the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act are proposed by the utilities, and the PSC reviews them for appropriateness and applies some tests, which we will describe a little later, to determine whether they can be approved. The programs are aimed at increasing efficiency and reducing consumption. And the programs and goals are 2 separate things. The goals are the target, the programs are how they intend to get there. So goals, again, as I mentioned before, would be the percentage. Our current average goal in Florida is 0.12%. For some of our utilities, they proposed a 0% efficiency goal in 2019, which was rejected by the commission. The programs are things such as energy audits or building codes improvements. There are other weatherization programs, all things that can help to try and reduce the consumption of the electricity users or shift that demand period. So in Florida, we have in the summer an afternoon peak when everyone turns on their AC to try and cool off. So typically programs address air conditioner efficiency, try and provide you rebates or credits on getting a more efficient air conditioning unit so that you're not drawing as much power in that peak time frame. In the winter, it's the early morning hours as people get ready for work and turn on heat. So those are the main goals of those programs is to address those. So the PSC assesses these programs and outcomes and determines whether the goals are met in an evaluation that occurs every 5 years. So the regulatory component of this is an attempt to incentivize energy efficiency and conservation at the utility scale level. This is most commonly done through demand side management, so through addressing the customer-based consumption of energy. So energy efficiency does not typically apply in this sense to the utilities being more efficient in their energy production. So none of these goals or programs address energy efficiency losses from less efficient power generation methods. Obviously things like nuclear generation or solar generation or wind generation are a bit more efficient than coal or natural gas production. So none of this applies to that. This is all based on the end line of the energy consumption. So approaches to things like the Energy and Efficiency Conservation Act differ across the country. Florida is not the only one with it. And depending upon the regulatory structure and their authority and capacity, the different regulatory authorities similar to the Public Service Commission have different approaches to it. So as I said, you'll notice that in Florida, we have a very low rate, some of the lowest in the nation, whereas even in the same utility, you'll see massive differences because of the way that programs are structured. Duke Energy, for example, is one that in North Carolina, where they also operate, they achieve about a 0.6% energy efficiency year over year, whereas in Florida, they achieve about 0.2%. And that has a lot to do with how programs are evaluated and implemented and what their incentives are to achieve those. So moving on to tests and assessment, the goals are assessed against what is considered to be the technical potential of available technologies. And what that means is we cannot expect utilities to reduce consumption or improve energy efficiency beyond what is technically feasible. We'd all love it if they could suddenly make everything far more efficient, but they have to be both cost effective and technically feasible, so things that are currently on the market. So it would include things such as LED bulbs, improved insulation. There are new attempts to address what are called vampiric loads. So reducing your electronic devices that still draw power even when they're quote unquote off, things like computers or printers or other appliances. So things like that are considered part of those programs to address the goals. In Florida, we use 2 tests. There are various tests that are used across the country, but Florida is the only one that uses what is called RIM, which is the Rate Impact Measure. The RIM test is a determination of whether utility rates, what they charge you for your electricity, will need to increase if a program, say an energy audit program or a home weatherization program, will account for lost utility revenue as a result of lower energy consumption by the customer. So to break that out a little bit further, they're seeking in the RIM test to identify that programs will not increase rates for non-participating ratepayers. As most of these programs are funded through all of the rates that are paid by customers, if you go and get improved insulation put in your house, your energy bill will decrease. Under the RIM test, that is seen as a loss to the utility because they now no longer get the extra money that you are saving and putting in your pocket. It used to go to them, now it stays with you. So that cost, what they are now missing out on, is allowed to be recouped through general rate increases, which are then distributed approximately evenly across all of their customer base. So this creates a scenario in which a program that lowers an individual customer's bill will do worse in the test than a program that keeps the bill the same or increases it. Florida is the only one that uses this test, and this is one of the potential changes that Audubon Florida would recommend be made in the new rule, is addressing this use of the rate impact measure. The second test is what's called the Participants Cost Effectiveness Test. And this is essentially a 2-year payback window screen. So if a program is going to have a rate of return to the customer faster than 2 years, the program will be determined not viable. So if they provide an opportunity for you to get a rebate on your air conditioner, and that's going to save you more than the equal amount of the cost of the air conditioning unit within 2 years, it will not be deemed an effective program. This one's a little harder to understand and explain because it is attempting to address what's called a free ridership problem, which is the notion that people who have money will be able to recoup that money faster than the utility would be able to recoup it themselves. And this is another one that is mostly only used in Florida. There's a few other states, but it is not commonly applied. So the utilities propose these programs under the notion that it will require ratepayers, the customer, more than 2 years to recoup the cost of anything that they would incur. And that helps to alleviate some of the downward pressure on utility rates and allow utilities to stay abreast of what their operating costs are. If these programs create too great of return, the utilities are only allowed rate increases once a year. So if programs are too effective, then they begin to lose more money than they can recoup year over year. So it's not necessarily a bad method, but there are more effective ones, which we don't have a whole lot of time to get into in this specific training, but it will be something that we discuss a little bit further down the line. Some other ones that you will hear are total resource cost test, which is the total cost of energy in the utility service if it is going to decrease. So that is the total cost for both the ratepayer as well as the utility. If you are consuming less, then the utility needs to move less energy through its transmission lines, which reduces operation and maintenance costs. And it includes just a little bit more of a complex suite of variables. So to move on to the proposed changes, this is the result of a workshop that was held in January, on January 14th, as a result of the Public Service Commission asking staff to propose amended language to the rule to address the issues seen from the utilities and the commission on their inability to meet the goals. So the rule is not very long, but they have only opened up a small section of it. That's not to say that we can't open up the rule further, but for right now, it is a very select segment of the rule. The staff stated that the intent of the goal of the workshop was to try and improve the administrative side of the demand side management programs. So again, demand side management is the method of addressing the customer-based consumption and pattern of energy consumption. What the staff have recommended from the PSC is linking the goals and programs in their submission. Previously, goals were set as a result of a study done by the utility and presented to the commission as to what was feasible given what is currently on the market. So they would set goals as a percentage of their total sales of energy. So if they sell 1,000 kilowatt hours, they could recommend that they would see a 1% decrease in that consumption to 990 kilowatt hours. Plans and programs would then be filed after the goals are approved by the commission. So the commission would examine what the proposed reduction and conservation effort is, and then the utility would again propose the programs that they think will help them achieve that goal. There are no penalties associated with missing your goals, so but it definitely creates more attention on the utility than they would potentially want. So programs, again, include things like energy audit programs, energy education. You know, you'll see a lot of things coming from FP&L and others about turning off appliances or turning up your thermostat in the summer, turning it down in the winter, things that help reduce energy consumption. So the staff recommended that these two, the goals and the programs, be submitted simultaneously. And this is attempting to allow utilities to have more control over the connection between their goal and the programs that will be needed to meet that goal. There is a potential conflict in that timing, as the statute currently requires that goals be set before plans are approved. There is still a provision in the rule that would allow the commission to approve goals before approving programs and plans. But if there is no commission directed concern with the goals or the plans, they can both be approved collectively. So that would essentially reduce our opportunities for engaging on goals or plans that Audubon, Florida, and other advocacy organizations do not think are effective or going to achieve their desired goal. So again, the rule itself is a lot more in-depth and detailed than we wanted to present you with today. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions and take some time, and we can always back up and review. Oh, next steps, sorry. So our next steps, to give everyone kind of that end roadmap, is Audubon, Florida is preparing a comment letter to the PSC regarding the amended FEECA rule, proposed amended FEECA rule. And our hope is that the chapters can sign on to the letter. And that was the purpose of this training, is to make sure that chapter presidents and staff are well educated on what is being proposed and asked of in the letter, which will be shared in this coming week. There is a future workshop to be held on FEECA. At the end of the January 14th workshop, staff stated that there would be another workshop pertinent to comments and submissions related to their amended rule. The close for comment period is February 15th, so we will make sure that the chapters receive our draft letter before the 15th with enough time to review and ask any questions or express any concerns you may have. We will also further develop educational seminars similar to this one on the Public Service Commission, FEECA, and other utility regulation topics as Audubon, Florida begins to engage further on climate and energy issues related to the Public Service Commission. For those of you that are interested in learning more about the Public Service Commission, they are holding a commission conference tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. You can find the link on either the Florida channel, so floridachannel.org.com, or you can go to psc.state.fl.us, or just even look up Florida Public Service Commission, and they live broadcast their conferences. The conference tomorrow will include a number of rate cases, and you can start to get an example of what the PSC structure starts to look like. Nothing tomorrow morning is related to the Florida Energy and Efficiency and Conservation Act, but it will help you start to get a sense of who the commissioners are and how the commission operates. So with that, now we can move on to questions and go backs and anything else that I may have moved over too quickly.
Thank you so much, David. So there's been a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna go through those first. And then if anybody else has any other questions as we're having this conversation, please also share those in the chat. So scrolling back, I think the first question may have been answered, and it was, how do you measure energy efficiency savings for a utility? So I don't know if you just want to summarize that very quickly.
Yes, so energy efficiency savings as regard to the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act are measured as a percentage reduction in total sales of kilowatt hours. So again, the example would be a utility that sells 1,000 kilowatt hours would propose some percentage of that to be reduced next year. The utilities are required every year to supply the Public Service Commission with their total sales revenue of both dollar amount as well as the kilowatt hours they sold. So there would be a measurable decrease in time from year over year as to whether they were meeting those goals. So it's a measure, a percentage of the total kilowatt hours sold.
Thank you. There was another question here about the 2-year payback test, and that was what Audubon's position is regarding that.
So the 2-year payback test is something that it essentially knocks out the quote unquote low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency. And there's arguments to be made on both sides. If something is going to have a payback rate within 2 years, the going economic notion within the commission is that the customer has the economic advantage to do that on their own. So if you're going to see a massive return on installing attic insulation in your home, and it's within the next 2 years, your kind of economic valuation of that is likely going to be that it's worth it for you to do. So they're trying through that test to eliminate things that people might do on their own and not require the utility to provide incentives or rebate programs for that. The issue is that there are segments of our population, low income and others, that do not have that capacity, and those programs would be massively beneficial to them. So there are ways in which the 2-year payback program could be used for specific subsets of the customer base, but then still be allowed for low-income families. And that is another component that we're actively trying to work on, how that can be implemented into the proposed language.
Thank you. I also see here a comment that you may want to address, and it is that it seems to me that if less energy is used, less needs to be produced or bought by the utility, and thus there wouldn't be a rate increase.
So that's an interesting one, and it's not wrong, but thinking about utilities as a company, as someone that is providing a good and service. As you reduce demand for that, they still have all of those facilities, all of that generation, all of that transmission, and they still have to provide for the peak. They are statutorily mandated that they have to provide energy to the people that pay them for it. So this is where the utilities and advocacy groups tend to butt heads a lot, and what Audubon Florida is specifically trying to work on addressing in a constructive and science-based manner of providing quote unquote incentives for utilities to reduce energy production and consumption. Basically, other states have provided a guaranteed rate of return less than or equal to the reduction in energy bills that they're seeing. So to back that up a bit, other states have allowed utilities to get almost kickbacks for they're not called kickbacks, I shouldn't use that word, to get a return for reducing the energy consumption. They see less revenue through that, but they are then rewarded for reducing the energy consumption within their customer base.
Thanks. There's another question here, and it was, it may have been a follow-up question to something that you were saying, and I'm sorry if I'm not putting this in quite the right location, but what about customers who may just be using less energy because of economic hardship?
Would that person be able to explain that question a little bit more?
Yeah, Deborah, if you could explicate that in the chat just a little bit. I'm sorry, I think I'm taking it out of the context in which you wrote it, because I didn't see it in time. And while Deborah's doing that, there are also some other questions surrounding solar. One, whether utilities can be required to install solar on folks' homes as an energy efficiency measure. And two, whether installing solar means that other customers pay higher rates.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one. And that starts to dovetail with another issue that has come before the commission and will come before the commission again. It's the notion of net metering. So people that have solar or other renewable generation facilities on their own property currently have the ability to sell that back to the utility. There's a discussion as to whether or not that rule should be changed. So to answer your question, utilities are not and cannot be required to install solar on rooftops. They could propose that as a program of their own, but under the current rules, programs like that would likely not be deemed cost efficient because the cost of solar panels is still relatively high, especially for the installation of solar panels on a private residence as opposed to utility scale solar. Requires just a little bit more capital cost per kilowatt hour produced. So those programs would, under the current regulation, likely fail both the rate impact measure and the 2-year payback period, depending upon the size of the unit. So no, they cannot be required to do that. It would be a program that could be deemed beneficial, but is unlikely with our current tests used.
Thank you. And we did have a clarification on the previous question about energy usage. And it was that just as a measure, would the reduction in energy sold perhaps be inaccurate if people are using less because they can't afford to use more?
That's an interesting question. And because the efficiency goals are tied to the pure amount of energy sold, so if you are not using energy because you cannot afford to, that would not reflect within their total kilowatt hours sold because you haven't used any. So I understand where you're going with that question as it relates to low-income families and the impacts of the pandemic. Those aspects are being addressed through other means. There are commission conferences held in regards to the removal of people from connections and other methods. But as it relates to the calculation of energy efficiency, that would not be included in part of that.
There's another question here that's related, so I'm going to yoke those together before going to see some of the other ones. Referring to Deborah's question, somebody else mentioned that this is an environmental justice issue. And the question is anybody looking at that at the PSC level? And I guess there's a couple of ways to think about this. One, is that something that the PSC, themselves considers? And or two, are there movements to bring that to their attention anytime in the future?
That's a great question. And it is something that we have kind of kept as part of our working comments to the Public Service Commission. There is a requirement that utilities provide a set amount of energy to low-income housing and low-income families at a reduced rate. That is statutorily required. That's not within this specific statute, but it is something that the utilities are required to do. It's obviously not all families. That could always be increased, and that's something that would potentially be advocated for when that opportunity arises. As it pertains to the energy conservation, there is a nexus to the environmental justice argument. And it's a difficult one to detangle, because the way that rates are applied across all ratepayers, you do not want to create a situation in which the haves can continue to invest in reduction of energy consumption at their homes, and that have negative impacts to other ratepayers across the state. So, if a very affluent community builds incredibly energy efficient homes and they all install rooftop solar, that utility that provides energy to that area starts to see a revenue decrease, which they can then take to the commission and petition for a rate increase to recoup those lost costs related to what they've had to expend to build the generating facility and the transmission lines to those homes. That rate increase would get applied across all of the ratepayers and would potentially increase rates for people that are not participating in those programs. So this is where both Audubon Florida's comments need to be rooted very deeply in sound scientific and environmental justice and utility regulatory foundations, so that we make sure that the things that we are proposing and the actions that we request the commission to take are going to provide the greatest good.
There's a couple of comments here, so I'm gonna, I know I'm looking at the time. We have some time for a couple more, but I'm gonna throw a couple of them out. So one is about how the rim test could be improved. And if you want to start there, we can start there, and then I'll go back for more.
So the rim test being improved is an interesting way to frame it. Florida is the only state that uses the rim test. And it is the only test that slates decreases in customer bills as a loss to the utility. So other tests, they take things into account regarding additional resource savings and other non-monetized benefits. So things like, what is the environmental benefit of having to produce less energy? That is not something that is considered in the rim test. So the rim test is very specifically designed to be narrow in focus and almost to address that environmental justice issue of making sure that it will not increase rates among all ratepayers. But it has this fatal flaw in framing everything as a benefit to the customer as a loss to the utility. So I don't know that the rim test can be changed to be better in and of itself, but we are looking at some of the other tests that are used in places such as Arkansas or North Carolina that seemingly, according to what their average energy efficiency and conservation goals are, have been better methods of assessing programs.
Thanks. There's another question here about Florida's rapid population growth and how or to what extent that affects energy efficiency goals.
So again, energy efficiency goals are tied directly to the total kilowatt hours sold. So as they sell more, as our population increases, they technically do have to save more, but you have more opportunities and people to potentially participate in cost-saving measures. And again, this is another component within that assessment that utilities are required to do of what is cost-effective and technically feasible. One of the assumptions that they need to make is a assessment of what the growth rate of the state is and what their customer base is, as that will determine what they think is economically viable. That's one thing that we may recommend in our comment to the Public Service Commission is decoupling that utility-led study to being a either service commission-led study, or a third-party commission-led study, with the notion that there are standard assumptions across all the utilities as to what the growth rate of Florida is, what the proposed or forecast price of fuel costs are, things like that are not currently standardized. So population being one of those that can affect how we interpret and address energy efficiency, but it's fairly well linked with the percentage and with the amount of people you have to potentially participate in the program.
Okay, let me pull up the chat again. There was a question about whether Florida utilities produce all their energy or have contracts to produce energy from larger other producers. And David from Halifax River Audubon said, having retired from FPL, I can say that they do purchase bulk energy from other utilities when those suppliers offer sales to other utilities. These are done at the transmission level, sometimes daily. So David, I don't know if you wanted to just comment on that or add to that.
Yeah, that's great. And David from Halifax is exactly correct, obviously. And there are other potential agreements that kind of sit in standing of if there is a increased need for generation and a utility is unable to provide it with their current capacity, they have agreements with other regional utilities or across state lines to purchase power in that moment. So those are things that are addressed at a much more finite detail than the commission is concerned, but yes, there are what they call power purchase agreements.
All right, and there was a question from Scott about further action. Are we considering any other actions such as reaching out to the entire Audubon Florida advocacy base and chapter member base with things like editable sign-on type letters or action alerts or things like that? And I can jump in here really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, please do.
And just say that at the moment, we're still really early in the process. So that's why we wanted to have this call first with all of you. And then as we know more and as the process evolves, we'll be reaching out to other advocates and the larger advocacy base. So there is a vision for that in the future, but as we're just getting started with this was our initial first step.
And there are other advocacy groups that are doing individual outreach letters. Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and Vote Solar are two of the main ones. They do a great job of engaging their constituents. And if you go on the PSC website, you can follow dockets in which all of the public correspondence is logged pertinent to whatever hearing or workshop you're referring to. And when they send out their email blasts, you'll see just hundreds and hundreds of emails come through. So they're very effective at engaging people on that manner. I think the goal for Audubon Florida is for us to help to educate our members, and especially the chapter presidents, to be able to engage more directly to the commissioners writ large. And to do that, we wanted to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of what we're asking and what exactly our goal is and where it currently stands, and have a little bit of background context. Sending out, you know, a editable form email, while a great advocacy action, we want to do things at Audubon Florida that have meaningful impact and can help to improve our opportunities in the future.
All right, there was another question that I just answered in the chat, and then Bill, again, I think you asked the question, wouldn't that be a cost saving area at a time that it was relevant to the conversation? And I have lost that moment in time. So if you could clarify that, we'll take your question and then we'll take one last one before we've got to close out. So there was another question, I'm just going to read it out loud. Florida IOU's business model relies on unregulated activities, construction of new power plants, transmission lines. So a reduction in demand goes against that model. Does that model need to be changed before they adopt meaningful EE or conservation measures?
Well, that's an interesting question when you start to look broadly across the country at other states in which they are actively pursuing more advanced energy efficiency measures. Oftentimes, like I said, by the same company. Duke Energy in North Carolina is achieving 4, 5, 6 times more energy efficiency than Duke Energy Florida. And the reason for that is the structure of the regulation in North Carolina versus Florida. There are incentives provided. They are rent-seeking companies, right? They want to turn a profit. They are obliged to turn a profit for their stakeholders. So when there's an incentive attached to energy efficiency, it becomes just innately economically viable as long as the incentive is great enough. In Florida, we don't provide incentives for it. It is purely based on things, like I said, the RIM test and the participant cost test. Those don't have any kind of performance incentives. There's no reason for a utility to engage in those things. So we have an opportunity within this rule to potentially address some of those issues and start to stem the tide and turn it towards making that model more viable. You're not wrong in that it goes kind of against their model of, you know, they're reducing the volume of the product they're selling, but there are ways for that to be mutually beneficial for both the utility and the customer.
All right, and we got a clarification on that other one. Would the purchase of less energy due to less need result in cost savings?
The purchase of
and I think, Bill, is that in reference to utilities purchasing energy from other suppliers? It may be. Well, we'll come back to that one. Yes, he says yes.
Okay. Can you read the question again? I'm sorry.
Sure. I unfortunately.
Yeah.
So essentially, if I think the question is there a cost savings for utilities when demand goes down because of energy efficiency measures that have been implemented for those utilities that are buying energy, because they no longer have to purchase energy.
Yeah.
But yes. I think this goes back to what you were saying about the infrastructure and the generation still being there. David, are you there?
Yes. Can everyone hear and see me again?
Now we can, but you were frozen for a couple of moments.
Sorry about that. Yes, it could potentially be a energy and cost savings. But again, as the goals are related to a percentage, you wouldn't necessarily see a big shift in that. And since utilities try and do right among one another, there's no real price gouging going on in those scenarios. As David from Halifax mentioned, there are opportunities for sale. If someone turns on a generating unit and then their demand suddenly plummets, they now have excess energy they can sell at a reduced rate. So there's the economics of utilities is wildly fascinating and wildly complicated. So to answer that question would require a little bit more time than we've got left. So, but it's something to definitely keep in mind, and it's a good question.
So I think that's all the time that we have for right now. We're coming just up on 6 o'clock. I think we've gotten through most of the questions.
And I will reiterate again that we will be providing quote unquote one-pagers, front and back of a side of paper on both the Public Service Commission and their kind of background and what they cover and regulate, as well as another one-pager on FEECA, the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, and a little bit of context on that, a little bit more information on both the RIM test and the participant cost test. And we will be reaching out with a little more information as we develop our comment letter for chapter presidents to review and potentially sign on to. And if anyone has further questions, don't hesitate to reach out. This is a very complex, very regulatory focused topic, and I appreciate everyone taking the time this evening. It's not the most sexiest topic, but I appreciate everyone sticking with it and listening.